Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Nina Stack, President of the Council of New Jersey Grantmakers. The Council is very pleased to host this webinar to help our members better understand Governor Christie's proposal for funding education in the state. I want to thank our Education Funders Affinity Group co-chairs, Wendy Liskow and Barbara Reisman, for making this webinar happen, and of course thank David Sciarra. We are recording the webinar and will be available to the public on our website. Because of the nature of the issue, actually I'm going to stop right there and ask if people would please mute your lines by pressing *6. Okay.
Get started.
We are recording the webinar and it will be available to the public on our website. Because of the nature of the issue, we were asked to break with tradition and open this webinar up to the grantees of our member organizations. We will have a 35-minute presentation and then open it up for Q&A. Please be sure to mute your line, as I said, by pressing *6. When we get to the Q&A portion, you can unmute your line by pressing *7. Or you can use the mute button on your phone as well. I'll also say that everyone should see at the bottom of their screen an opportunity to ask a question where it says Chat with Presenter. At any point in the program, you can type in a question and the presenters, Wendy Liskow and David, will be able to see your question and should be able to respond. As I say, so please feel free to send your questions in at that from where you can see on the screen. They'll be monitored along the way. It's now my pleasure to turn the program over to Wendy Liskow, Education Program Director at the Geraldine R. Dodge Foundation. Thank you, Wendy.
Thank you, Nina. We are very grateful to the Council for this mechanism, this webinar opportunity to update our membership and interested stakeholders about important issues like this school funding formula. And I do want to just underscore what Nina said about sending in your Q&A questions. We have about 15 minutes at the end of David's presentation, and we know that there will probably be a lot of questions, so we'll try to organize those and get so that everyone can get their question in. We couldn't have a more well-versed presenter than David Sciarra, who is the Executive Director of the Education Law Center. He is a practicing civil rights lawyer since 1978. He's litigated a wide range of cases involving socioeconomic rights, including affordable housing, shelter for the homeless, and welfare rights. However, since 1996, David has litigated to enforce access for low-income and minority children to an equal and adequate education under state and federal law, and has served as counsel to the plaintiff students in New Jersey's landmark Abbott versus Burke case. This decision and 21 subsequent reinforcing decisions served as the foundation for New Jersey's 2008 School Funding Reform Act, the SFRA. This law was passed with the promise of dramatically changing the way that state school aid is distributed to districts, using an equitable and predictable weighted student formula that links resources to the cost of achieving the state's academic standards. The formula has been underfunded, however, for about approximately $8 billion over the past 8 years. Now Governor Christie has proposed an alternative budget for school funding, and so we are very pleased to have David Sciarra with us today to walk us through the current situation. David, I'm hoping you can kick us off with a brief overview of the current funding formula and proposed changes. And welcome.
Well, thank you, Wendy, and thanks to the Council, to Nina and Craig for hosting this. Thanks to everyone that's on, and thanks to Wendy and also Chris Daggett. The idea for this webinar came out of a discussion we were having last week about all of the permutations that school funding seems to be going through in New Jersey right now. And a special shout out also to any grant makers that are on the line that support our work. Thanks. We couldn't do it without your help. All right. So a little bit of background before I get into, I'm going to cover three topics, current topics. One, the governor's formula, which you no doubt have been reading about and hearing about, proposal, I should say. The proposal made by Senate President Stephen Sweeney, which is kind of seen now as a bit of a competing proposal. And then also something that just happened 2 weeks ago, which you may also have read about, which is a filing by the administration, the Christie administration, before the New Jersey Supreme Court in the Abbott versus Burke case that we here at Education Law Center are having now to deal with on a somewhat emergency basis with the court. And I'll talk to you a little bit about that. But first, a little background about the School Funding Reform Act of 2008. As Wendy mentioned, this really originates from the Supreme Court's decisions back in 1997 and 98, when the court, out of frustration with the executive and legislature's failure to come up with adequate funding formulas in the early 90s, sort of put its foot down and ordered what they called interim funding relief for the 31 districts that we now know as sort of former Abbott districts. The court calls them poor urban districts. I think you all probably know which districts these are. They range from Passaic and Patterson, Garfield in the north, all the way down to Bridgeton, Vineland in Cumberland County. They serve about 23, 24% of the state's total enrollment, but most importantly, they serve well over 50, close to 60% of all low-income children in the state. All of these districts' school systems serve very high concentrations of low-income children, English language learners, and children with disabilities. In 1997, as I mentioned, in 2008, the court actually ordered special funding remedies on an interim basis for these, to provide adequate resources for these school districts. Some of you that were around then may recall it was called parity funding, which was the amount spent in the suburbs, and then there was a supplemental programs component, which included preschool funding for the requirement that the court had directed that the state put in place universal high-quality preschool for all 3 and 4s and fund it in the 31 districts. As I said, those were interim remedies. The court always wanted and was very clear that it would replace these remedies if the legislature could come forward with a funding mechanism, statewide funding mechanism that ensured adequate funding for children, not just in the Abbott districts, but districts across the state. I should say that another important development that I know impacts on all of those of you that work with the schools or work in education, in the 1997 ruling, the court upheld as constitutional the core curriculum content standards and the state's assessment system to determine student proficiency in achieving those standards as constitutional. The challenge the court gave to the legislature back in 1997 was to come up with a formula that concretely linked the cost of education and the funding needed to the delivery of the state's content standards to children in all districts. So the court was very insistent that a new formula had to be driven by the cost of educating students, including the additional costs for poor children, English language learners, students with disabilities, to meet and achieve New Jersey's academic standard.
Is Dan going to be at the meeting?
As many of you know, the McGreevey administration and then over into the Corzine administration spent a lot of time in the mid to late 80s working on a new funding formula. And in late 2007, the legislature, on a bipartisan basis, adopted the School Funding Reform Act. The School Funding Reform Act is really a model for the nation. It is what we call in the school finance world a weighted student formula, which means that built into the formula for all children in the state, regardless of which district you are educated in, what's built into the formula is adequate resources for kids who don't have any additional educational needs, along with the additional costs, which are referred to as weights, for children who are low income, children in concentrated high poverty schools and school districts, English language learners, and students with disabilities. It was passed in 2008. It was funded for the first 2 years, the increases, and I should mention that most of the sort of former Abbott districts, I'll call them, not all of them, but some of them were, like many suburban districts, spending more than the formula calculation for their district yielded. But the biggest beneficiaries of the formula in terms of new aid were districts that had growing populations of low-income children but were not part of the Abbott group. So districts across the state like Clifton, Bayonne, Pennsauken, many of you know these districts that had growing concentrations of kids in poverty or English language learners, and had been left out of the Abbott funding streams during the 90s, excuse me, or the 2000 period. As I mentioned, the formula was funded for the first 2 years. Then when Governor Christie was elected, his first budget, he cut all that funding out, about $1.1 billion, and the increase for the following year. We went back to the Supreme Court to enforce a requirement that the formula be funded at least for the first 3 years. And in 2011, the court ordered the governor to put the funding back in, but only for the 31 districts that are part of the Abbott case. So the bottom line to bring us to date is, for the last 7 years of the Christie administration, we've had districts under the formula that saw all of the initial increases they got in the first 2 years eliminated. The Abbott districts were made whole as of 2011, but even those districts now have been flat funded. Everybody's been flat funded really since 2012. So we've had both cuts to the formula and flat funding, so that many districts across the state are both spending below what the formula calculates you should be spending in your budget, the amount of money you should have in your budget, and they're also not getting, obviously not getting the state aid that's required under the formula. One last point, and then I'll get to where we are today, is despite that, the legislature has stood by the formula. I think that they would have liked to have put some money into the formula, but the governor has line item veto over the budget, so he's made it clear that he would use that. He actually used it in this past budget when he eliminated $25 million new aid to fund the expansion of preschool under the formula to other high-need districts across the state. Our sense is that the legislature has just kind of given up trying to do anything in terms of getting more funding into the formula. But that said, they have stood by the formula. It remains on the books. It is used every year to calculate districts' what we call adequacy budgets, which is the amount they're supposed to spend under this weighted formula. And it's also used to distribute aid in various categories. It's also used to calculate the amount of money districts are required to or should be raising off their local property tax. So the the formula remains in law. It remains, it has been used every year. It just hasn't been funded. The last thing is that we have gone, the Christie administration and the legislature, the formula requires that every 3 years the costs in the formula be revisited by the commissioner. We've had 2 of those under the Christie administration, 2 what we call adequacy reports. The legislature has responded to those reports as they're allowed to under law to correct some changes that the arbitrary changes that the administration wanted to make. The point I'm trying to make here is that despite the rhetoric you might hear, the SFRA remains the 2 things. The SFRA remains the funding formula that's in place despite the fact that it's been underfunded. And also it has the approval of the Supreme Court so that any attempt to change the formula insofar as it impacts on the urban districts would have to get Supreme Court approval. So I think it's important to keep those things in mind. Okay, so the governor, in a bit of a surprise about 6 months ago, came out full force behind a alternative plan that had been floated for a number of years by Senator Michael Dougherty from Warren County, which would dramatically change the way schools are funded in New Jersey, and obviously would require the removal by the legislature or repeal by the legislature of the SFRA, and it would require court approval. So those are pretty substantial political and legal hurdles that the governor's plan would have to surmount in order to actually become law and be implemented to fund our schools. But he has been traveling, as you know, around the state, doing town halls, presenting this formula and this plan. And I thought I'd take a few minutes to walk you through what we know about it. And we don't know a lot of details. We know what's on the governor's website about this, which is the basics of this. There's a lot of questions about it, and you may have questions about it, but I'll try to give you the outlines of what the governor is proposing. In actuality, the governor's proposal is not a funding formula in the sense that it really looks at the cost of education, and then it looks at and how much we should be spending for students in each district, and then looks at state revenue, and then also gets into the amount of local property tax revenue that should be raised for schools. It's simply what I would call a state aid redistribution plan. So all it deals with is the state aid component of education funding. The governor has said nothing about what would happen to the local property tax requirements for schools. He's indicated that this would not. There's no discussion of changing education costs or anything like that. This is what I would call a plan to take state aid that's currently in the system and get rid of the way in which it gets allocated under the current formula and redistribute it in a whole new way. So I'm going to go through some of these slides, and if you can try to follow me along, I'm looking at a slide now, Governor's Fairness Formula. I should say, in our view, and I'll be candid about this, this proposal is hardly fair, but that's what the governor calls it. And here's what the governor is calling for. So you take all the state aid that's currently being given to schools across the state, urban, suburban, middle class, rural, under the formula, and you put it all in one pot. It's very simple. Just put it all in one big pot. And then you distribute it to every student in the state, regardless of need, regardless of the community in which they live and the wealth of that community, the property wealth, the household income, how rich, how poor it is, how much municipal services it has to deliver, so forth and so on. And then you just divide it up on an equal per pupil basis and give it out to every student across the state. That's it. So according to the governor's website and the state budget, the total amount of money that would be pooled is about $9 billion. Now this includes a number of different aid categories under the current formula. The biggest one called equalization aid, which is for the basic program for all the kids in each district. But what gets pooled is special education funding for kids with disabilities, and preschool education aid, which is about now $650 million, which funds the Abbott pre-K program for 3s and 4s, which many of you know, and now is considered one of the nation's premier early education programs, and other districts that get preschool. There are other districts also that get some preschool funding. All of that gets pooled into this $9 billion pot, divided up per pupil, and according to the governor's calculations, that comes to an estimated $65.99 per pupil. So every school district across the state would get $659 in state aid for every student, regardless of whether the student is in Newark, Camden, Cape May, Princeton, Short Hills, wherever. Everybody gets $65.99 per pupil. Now, we have, let me see if I can, okay. All right. So I wanted to give you a sense of how this plays out in terms of current spending. So this chart will tell you, so we've divided the school districts in the state up by low wealth to high wealth districts. In other words, poor to more affluent districts. And this gives you the amount that we put on here, just to give you a sense of this, the 100 highest spending districts. These are the 100 in each, across the state. And if you see, if you look at this chart, I would look at the right side, the budgetary cost per pupil, because that's the amount really that is available to educate kids in schools that the school districts actually get now. If you look at the breakdown, there are 20 districts in the low category and about 24 districts in the high category. It's relatively comparable in terms of the highest spending districts across the state in terms of amount. The next slide gives you a different calculation, and just to give you a sense of what districts are spending now. Again, these are the 100 highest funded districts in the state, a snapshot of them. And if you actually weight the funding by weighted student enrollment under the formula, which is what we like to use because that accounts for the vast differences in student need across New Jersey. As you know, one of the hallmarks of the public education landscape in New Jersey is we have districts with intense concentrations of poor students, students of color, students with other needs, alongside districts that have very low concentrations of those students. So the weighted per pupil average simply takes the weighted enrollment that each district gets under the formula, which accounts for those differences, and divides it up. So what you see is that when you weight for student need, the more affluent districts and the middle income districts still have more money than the lower income districts generally. So that's kind of a picture of sort of where we are. Now, if you want to look, so we tried to estimate what would be the impact of the governor's radical, I should say, really dramatic state aid redistribution plan on districts across the state by district wealth. Again, low, middle, and high. And here we're looking at we've divided the state up into all districts and then districts facing cuts, because what would happen if this were to go into effect is that districts that depend more on state aid, which tend to be the lower wealth districts, the poorer districts, would lose state aid. And districts which are more affluent, which don't get a lot of state aid, would get pretty, significant infusions. Now that's a general statement, but these would be significant infusions of new state aid. So this is sort of how it plays out. The total statewide cut to districts would be about $2,023 on average to those districts that are cut. Now, that's all I'm talking about, is the districts that get a cut. But if you look at the 143 districts that are cut, and just look at that group, the amount is about $6,184 per pupil on average. So the bottom line here is the 143 districts that will lose funding, state aid, under the governor's plan, will lose on average $6,184 per pupil, which accounts for about, on average, 33% of their current total operating budget. And if you go down the right-hand side of the screen, you see the breakout between low, middle, and high. The low wealth districts get hit the most, the hardest. So 78 of those districts would lose funding. They would lose about $7,417 on average per pupil, or on average among those districts, about 40% of their budget. Newark, for example, would lose 60% of its operating budget if this went into effect. So obviously the 40%, the 7414 is an average. There are districts that are more than that, districts that are less than that. 56 middle wealth districts would lose, but a lot less, only 8% of their budget, or $1,494. And no surprise, the highest wealth districts across the state, 129 of them would not lose anything. We could do a slide to show who gains, but we didn't do that. We just wanted to give you a sense of what would lose. Essentially, this money that's being lost in the red parentheses actually is being shifted to other districts, mostly districts in the middle and high wealth category. So we tried also to estimate what would be the impact on the districts that lose in terms of, give a sense of what would be the scale of the cuts to programs, staff, services, physical education, arts, everything, right? What would the preschool, obviously each district, if this were to happen, who lose the amounts of money we're talking about, would have to make fairly dramatic reductions in program, staff, and services. We don't know how they would play out, obviously, but we did try to estimate, based on current data, what would be, kind of the sense of what would be the staffing cuts. And that's what this right-hand side of this gives you. The bottom line here is that that low-income districts, the low-wealth districts, would lose about 21,000 staff. money to the budget cuts would, now obviously that would not happen. They try to do other ways of making cuts, but to give you a sense of the scale of what would be lost here, it's very, very dramatic. And obviously, pupil-to-teacher ratios would go up, so forth and so on. So we obviously can't tell you what the specific impacts would be. Bottom line is these would be dramatic reductions in essential resources that are currently made available under the SFRA if this were to go into effect, impacting those 147 districts, many of which are districts that are serving very high concentrations of low-income students. The other point I should make is that the governor has said, and it's not clear, that the money that's going to the higher wealth districts, the redistribution, actually the money that's getting redistributed, the schools, those districts would actually not benefit either. Now, we don't know the details, but the schools themselves would get these vast infusions of new state aid as a result of the redistribution. It is our understanding that those districts would not be able to use that money for education, but would be required to use it for property tax relief, to lower the school tax portion of the tax bill. Now, and that's really the governor's big selling point here, that basically we're going to move all this money around, and in districts where there is, in communities that have high property tax rates, for schools and for municipal services and county taxes, they would see a windfall from this that would have to be used for property tax relief to dramatically lower property tax bills in those communities. So one way to think about this formula, it's kind of a reverse Robin Hood, if you will, in the sense that you would be taking a lot of money that's in the system now that's supporting the education of children in poor districts who are largely low income, removing that funding and giving it to middle and more affluent districts to lower property tax bills. That's what we know. Again, there's not a lot of detail on how that would be done, but I've actually talked to superintendents in districts where they've been contacted by the governor's office, their communities would get some money back from this, and they've been told, you should support this because you're going to be able to use this for property tax relief. The governor's pitch mostly is to mayors, not to school people. And school people are telling me in these communities that, yes, our town might get a little bit back, but we're not going to see any benefit because it's going to go for property tax relief. But the point I also wanted to make here in this slide is that the losing districts would be crushed in another way. Not only would they lose significant chunks of their school budget, but these are the communities that are among the highest taxed in the state when you look at total equalized tax rates, or what we call in the school finance business municipal overburden. This slide just gives you a sense of the massive tax increases that would be required in many of these districts in order to try to make up the loss of the funding from the state. And again, these are districts, many of which have total equalized property tax rates for schools, municipal services, and county taxes that are well above the state average. So bottom line is these are communities that would be unable to address the cuts through increasing local revenue. So a few bottom lines on the governor's proposal from our viewpoint. You'll see substantial reductions in budget, staff, and programming in high-needs districts across the state. It's likely to end Abbott preschool and preschool expansion because there's simply no way that these districts would be able. See, right now under the SFRA, one of the the features that we like and others like is that the preschool money is lockboxed in a category that cannot be used for K-12. So a district like Union City, for example, could not take its preschool education aid, which supports its terrific preschool program for 3s and 4s, and use it to make up shortfalls in their K-12 budget, which used to be the case. But that would all end because all of this money gets pooled, and there's simply no way that the former Abbott districts could maintain the Abbott program. It's a costly program, very important program, but the costs of it that are built into the formula are not minimal. Let's put it that way. And also, the formula's expansion required expansion over 5 years, which hasn't occurred, but which I know some of you on this call are working hard to get back on the agenda, would probably end as well. And it, in effect, takes us back to the pre-1990s in New Jersey when, before we started the Abbott adventure, I should say, right? And the work all these many years by us and many, many others to get more equity and fairness built into our financing system, given the disparities or the vast differences in student need across districts in New Jersey. This would take us back to the pre-1990 disparities that we saw and that really launched the litigation in Abbott between low-wealth, high-need districts and high-wealth, low-need districts, suburban and urban, that whole disparity, which we've done a lot of really good work on in New Jersey, unlike other states like Pennsylvania, New York, and other places. We've done a pretty good job. We still have a ways to go, but we've made a lot of progress, like Massachusetts, in really eliminating a lot of those deep disparities between poor and rich districts, and those would come back, roaring back, onto the educational landscape as well. So that's the governor's proposal. The Sweeney-Ruiz proposal that's out there is pretty simple. It stands behind the formula, the SFRA. It recognizes that under the Christie administration, a big hole has been dug over these past 7 years of underfunding of the formula, that we're not going to get out of that hole in one fell swoop. So Senator Sweeney has been talking about phasing in new educational formula aid, targeted in the beginning to the districts that are most under adequacy, as we call it, have the most need, and phased in over 5 years. In other words, getting us back with $100 million, $200 million of new aid going into the formula every year. And then he wants to form a commission that would study making some changes to the formula, not getting rid of the formula, but some modifications, if you will, largely because the formula has been underfunded for so long. And one is something called adjustment aid, which is hold harmless aid that was put into the formula. There are districts who are spending more than the formula says you should be spending, who still get this hold harmless aid. It should have been, if the formula had been run, it would have been out of the system by now. But because it's been frozen and flat funded, there are districts that do get that, and there's been talk about capturing that and redistributing that to as part of the phase-in to full funding. We calculate that amount to be about $250 million in aid that's available. It's complicated to do it, though, because you also have districts which get adjustment aid that are right around adequacy, and you don't want to push them over. Some of them are high needs districts. But there is some, it's worth looking at it to see whether there's some aid that could be captured and redistributed that way to make up for the funding hole that we're in. There's a lot of talk about looking at the local fair share calculation, which is the calculation of how much districts in the formula should be raising off the property tax, and also the local levy, which is the amount they actually raise, and this whole issue of tax abatements and whether that, Jersey City has been the poster child for that discussion, which, does tax abatements play any role in that? I mean, that's probably worth a revisit to look at that and see if that can be modified and improved. And at the last minute, they threw in something that's much more complicated, which is looking at the special education funding in the formula, which is based on the census of the average special education population across the state. There's a lot of controversy about that. I'm not going to get into that, but Senator Sweeney added that in as an item to be looked at. And then he changed the date for the commission to report back to February 1st, 2017, which is a pretty ambitious timetable, assuming this gets passed. A version of this has not really moved in the Assembly. It's passed the Senate, but it's unclear what the Assembly will do. And lastly, and then I'll stop, is on this crazy sort of landscape here, is the governor, unbeknownst to us or the administration, unexpectedly filed a motion with the Supreme Court in mid-September, and they're asking the court to do essentially two things: to vacate the Supreme Court's 2008 ruling, which approved the School Funding Reform Act as constitutional for all children in terms of its delivery of resources and funding based on the core curriculum content standards. And he wants to freeze funding at current levels until what the papers describe as a new education system, no detail, can be enacted by the legislature in time for this 2017-18 next school year. The second thing he asked for is to give the commissioner kind of unlimited power to override any what they call impediment that might impede the provision of education, quality education to kids in the urban districts, particularly around the issue of teachers, effective teachers, and more time and instructional time, things like that. But essentially it's a kind of a broad request to give the commissioner, in effect, constitutional power under the court decision, only in the former Abbott districts, by the way, the power to override collective bargaining agreements with teachers and teacher layoff rules that are in statutes, things like that. I can tell you that we just heard from the court. There was some question about how the court was going to handle this, and we just heard from the court that. Hold on. Oh, I guess that's not it. Oh yeah. Okay. We just heard from the court actually today. So you're one of the first to know this, that the way the court has decided to handle this filing is that they've asked us to file what they're calling a preliminary brief response that addresses one question and one question only, and that is whether the application that the state has made should be before the court in the first place. And the reason I think they've asked that question to be resolved first is because the application that the administration has presented to the court contains no proposals that have been enacted by the legislature. So it's not as though, remember back in 2008, the Corzine administration got the legislature to approve and enact the School Funding Reform Act, then the state went back to the court to get it reviewed and to replace the prior special funding orders, which the court did. In both of these things that the state is asking for, they make a lot of, particularly in the area of collective bargaining and teacher work rules and whatnot, they make a lot of sort of general complaints that these things are problems for them. They also recognize that there was a major overhaul of the teacher tenure requirements in TEACH Act. Many of you may know about that in 2012, which lengthened the time for teacher tenure, changed the way teachers were evaluated to include test scores, and also streamlined the administrative process for dismissing teacher dismissals. Essentially what they're saying is, yeah, that's a great law, but it didn't go far enough. We'd like that power to address any of these problems that come up. But the problem is they never went to the legislature first with any of this to say, and the court's view on this in the past has been to not take these things up unless they're actually enacted by the legislature. So we'll see. I'm going to stop there.
Well, thank you, David. That was a great deal to process, but I think you made it very clear that this is like a three-dimensional chess game in many ways. Could you maybe address some of the possible, you sort of talked about some, but maybe what are some of the moves that could possibly happen once you file this breach?
Well, in terms of the court?
In terms of the court.
The fact that the court has asked for this kind of preliminary issue, or the issue of whether the administration is in the right forum in the first place, i.e. the court, for what they have presented, which are a lot of education policy problems and proposals that normally are taken up by the legislature first, tells me that the court may be moving to just dismiss this application altogether. And we are going to be asking for that. I never predict. I've done a lot. I do a lot of litigation here in New Jersey and elsewhere on these issues. I'm making no predictions, but I think the court, given its prior rulings, may just say, essentially say to the administration, look, you make a lot of proposals here, there's a lot of complaints here, go to the legislature first, you know where they are, and then maybe come back to us later if you can get anything done, especially around the issue of a new formula or getting rid of their order, which would effectively allow the state to end the SFRA. I doubt that they'll touch that at all. So I think that is a likely outcome for the court filing.
Okay. Does the governor have any moves?
Well, the problem, and some of you on this call are more politically, I think, astute than I am. The problem with the formula, his plan, is you got to get it through the legislature, and and you may even need a constitutional amendment to get it past the court. And the governor in his town halls, has been sort of taunting the legislature to take it up. And I saw something today that he was in Wayne yesterday talking about how the Democrats should put a constitutional amendment on the ballot that would allow this. All I can say is that we've had a lot of discussions with legislative leaders and others, and it's not going to happen because it would, and not because it would just, take money away from urban districts, but it would really, when you think about it, be a major blow to what is one of the highest achieving public school systems in the state, because the fallout of removing vast amounts of state aid from isolated, if you will, sort of segregated poor districts on surrounding districts in the entire state would be dramatic. And so I think that at the end of the day, politically, I think the governor's almost conceded it, that there's no chance that his proposal will get through the legislature. The only other possible scenario, and I don't want to get too far into this chess game, is there's been some discussion that the governor might try to put his fairness formula in his proposed budget to force us to go back to the court to challenge that and to force the legislature to rewrite the budget to make sure that it's consistent with the current formula. There's been some talk about that. We'll just have to wait and see what he does. I mean, it would be illegal for him to do that. It would violate court orders. It would violate separation of powers vis-a-vis the legislature. It's I think it's got a lot of problems, but there's been some talk that his last budget he might go out with a bang. So who knows? That's about the best I can say, Wendy.
Great, so you'll be ready for it all.
Oh, we're ready. We're ready.
Could you explain the actual? So, if you said that the proposed budget is a $9 billion budget, how does it differ than the current school funding budget?
So the $9 billion is actually in the system now this year.
Mm-hmm.
That's the amount of state aid that supports pre-K through 12 public education across the state. That includes, everything. It includes special education for children with disabilities, programs for English language learners, preschool, everything. So that $9 billion is not anything. There's no new money in that $9 billion. It's just what we spend now. And the governor's proposal takes that and just basically redistributes that funding the way I described.
Okay.
Which is obviously in violation of the formula. You have to get rid of the formula.
Okay. And you've pretty much said that this does not this probably won't become a court matter. But there are new Supreme Court justices on the court. Would that influence any decisions down the line?
Well, I think that given what the court told us today, that they're asking the preliminary question about whether they should even be, whether what the state has given them is even worthy of their consideration at this point, or whether they should just, tell them to go away and go to the legislature first. That tells me that that's consistent with what I would call institutional decision-making by the court over decades in many cases. The court doesn't give advisory opinions. It shies away from doing that. It doesn't like to get involved in issues that are not ripe for consideration or where there's no real controversy or anything like that. In the Abbott case, they've made it clear that they're not going to consider changes to the funding formula or replacing an existing funding formula unless there's an alternative that's been enacted by the legislature. Those are more institutional dynamics rather than, and I think that, and actually pretty conservative dynamics. So I think on this kind of preliminary question about whether the court should be involved at all, I don't think that, the fact that certain justices were appointed by the governor is going to make much difference. That said, we do have 5 justices now on the court who have not participated in prior rounds of the Abbott case, going particularly 2009 and 2011, including the Chief Justice, who recused himself from those cases because he was Attorney General when the School Funding Reform Act was enacted. Our indications are now he's ready to come back onto this because enough time has passed. But we do have 4 justices appointed by the governor who have not sat on a round of Abbott. But I still think that requires the state to make some kind of showing that they have some kind of alternative plan that is worthy of court consideration.
Okay. A specific question about Patterson. The Patterson superintendent has submitted a certification in support of the governor's bid to end Abbott. Although it's focused on collective bargaining, it will be used to bolster the case. We would love to hear your reaction to that.
Well, there were two certifications submitted by sitting superintendents, both of them in state-operated districts. State Superintendent Cerf was complaining a lot about getting rid of teachers who he thought was ineffective, all that. State Superintendent Evans complained more about restrictions in the collective bargaining agreement around things like providing more instructional time to students. But again, I don't think we're going to get to any of the merits of any of that, as I said, because the court, I think, will likely, and don't bet on it, but I think the court may just push this aside. The problem with what Superintendent Evans has said is that I think, we have lots of districts that have negotiated, teachers unions that have negotiated with districts, many districts, to extend instructional time during the day, so forth and so on. The problem is you've got to pay for it. And Patterson's problem is, the underfunding of the SFRA is causing deep, as I think the folks who know Patterson on this call know, has been causing a series of reductions in resources over the last couple of years. So there's no money there. So, I don't, it would have been nice if the state superintendent would have said something about that, but now it goes.
Okay. If anyone else has a question, please, we have 5 minutes left. You can type it in. But I also wanted to ask if, the people on the phone, you have some funders, you have nonprofit leaders as well. Is there anything that we should be doing right now? Are there any opportunities for us to advance equalizing education for all children with this through this conversation?
I think, it's hard for me to know kind of where all of you are at, but I think to the extent that you're supporting, your grant making is supporting educational services, interventions, programs, in schools. I think it's very important that it's great that you're on this call and, getting kind of a sense of what we're dealing with, because, we've got to maintain a strong foundational base of funding in these schools, because if that goes away, it's going to impact on many of the initiatives that I know so many of you are working on, whether it's in the arts or in other areas with our schools, particularly with our and student populations, particularly with our most needy kids and the schools that serve them. But I think one thing is to kind of is to educate yourselves and your staff and your boards about this, that this is a serious challenge. To the extent that you, can in some ways make your voices heard, by all means. It's also important for those of you that are working with communities that might benefit from getting a big chunk of money out of the governor's formula plan to reduce property taxes, that they really stop, and you urge them to stop and consider what the implications of that are for children across the state and other communities. That this is really about a state system, and we're all in this together, and we can't go back to the old days of would be a real tragedy for our state and for the future of our state if we went back to the old days where the quality of the education that kids got depended and the programs and opportunities dependent again on the wealth of your community and so forth and so on. So I guess I'll just stop there. I'm not sure what else I can say. I know some of you are involved in our networks and in other networks directly that are impacted by this, like preschool, trying to move preschool forward. We've talked with some of you already about directly supporting the efforts that we're involved in. If any of you at all would like to talk with us about how you'd like to get more specifically engaged with local communities or with your colleagues and others and groups that are working to make sure our successful programs keep going, feel free to reach out to us.
Well, we'll make sure that your contact information is part of this information, and I want to, that we send out after the webinar. I want to thank you, David, and I want to thank you for the fact that you actually really left us with a thought about our kids. That's really the final thought, that this is about having an equitable education for all children in New Jersey. I want to thank Nina and Craig again for allowing us to pull this webinar together in a very short time, and as well as you, David, and to all of you who are on the phone. And let's keep marching on. Thank you all.
Thank you so much.